Hey guys, tonight we're heading high into the bone-dry air of the Peruvian Andes where the sun scorches by day, the wind bites at night, and the last thing you expect to find is ... ice. Yes, ice. Real, solid, crunch under your sandals, ice. You're standing on an arid plateau that looks more like Mars than Earth. There's no fridge buzzing, no ice truck climbing up the rocky paths. And yet, centuries ago, people here managed to keep their food cold oozing. Nothing but rocks, timing, and a wild sense of patience. Now, I know what you're thinking. Ice in a desert. You're already sweating just imagining the altitude. Your lips are dry. Your breath comes in shallow puffs. And trust me, if you're hoping for a refreshing popsicle out here, you probably won't survive this. But that's the mystery. Somehow, the ancient peoples of this unforgiving land, long before electricity, or even the concept of thermodynamics, figured out how to make ice in the middle of the desert. And they did it centuries before the word refrigeration ever chilled a dictionary page. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, I'd love to hear your location and local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're here, standing in the Chanca region of southern Peru. The air is thin. The stars are close enough to pluck out of the sky, and you're shivering, despite being nowhere near a snowflake. Welcome to the Altiplano, a place where temperatures swing, harder than mood swings at a high school reunion. In the day, you're cooked. At night, you're meat in a cryo chamber. And this is where the ancestors got clever. You're trudging through dusty brush and camel-colored grass, and ahead is a strange arrangement of stones. They're flat, clean, almost polished by time. Some are propped up like salt, while others lie flat and wide, forming shallow basins in the hard-packed earth. They seem random, and the chill sets in, and the stars begin to creep across the sky as the last breath of sunlight dips behind the mountains. You start to understand what they knew. The heat's gone, stolen in minutes. The stones are cooling fast. The air turns glassy. You can see your breath now. It's the kind of cold that cuts, noise muffling the world like a thick blanket of snow. Even though there's none in sight, one of the basins ahead catches your eye. A shallow pool, barely an inch of water, rippling in the moonlight. The wind brushes over it, whispering as it slides between stone grooves. And then you swear you're not imagining it. There's a sheen forming, a thin crust right there. On the surface, the water is freezing. You crouch beside it, baffled. No modern insulation, no metal coils, no freon, just this stone basin. Some perfectly timed water and the biting night air. This, it turns out, was a kind of prehistoric fridge. It's not a trick, it's an ancient engineering feat. Historians still argue whether these basins were purely utilitarian or whether they served ceremonial purposes too. Some claim the Incas had an intuitive grasp of thermodynamics, using elevation and evaporation to freeze water. Others roll their eyes and say they just got lucky with the weather. But when you see the precision of how the basins are placed for shadow, tilted to catch or avoid the breeze, you begin to suspect this wasn't a happy accident. There's even a word for these places: coaches, natural or man-made depressions used for water collection, some of which became accidental freezers during the right weather conditions. The people here, particularly the Inca and pre-Inca civilizations like the Wari, were masters of microclimates. They understood something most people today overlook. The land has moods. If you whisper to it the right way, it answers. And speaking of whispers, one of the stranger tidbits that's floated down through the oral tradition is the tale of the stone that breathed. According to local legend, there's a rock in the mountains that exhales fog every time ice forms near it. The fog curls over the pond like a dragon's breath, signaling a good night for freezing. Scientists have found vents and cracks that emit mist due to thermal differences, but no one's pinpointed the actual breathing stone. Maybe it's real. Maybe it's a bedtime story for future bedtime historians. You lie back now on a cool patch of earth, the stars watching overhead. The basin beside you has fully iced over, reflecting the Milky Way in its crusty mirror. You begin to realize this wasn't just about staying cool. It was survival. It was ritual. It was cosmic alignment. And it was daily life. Food would spoil in days without some way to preserve it. In these highlands, where crops could freeze, burn overnight, or burn in the day, managing temperature was survival magic. And they pulled it off with stone, water, and an incredible amount of patience. Of course, it wasn't refrigeration in the modern sense. There were no shelves, no labels, no annoying fridge light you accidentally leave on. But it was refrigeration in principle, manipulating the environment to store perishables longer. And for that, they needed more than just stone basins. They needed timing, astronomical awareness, and an intimacy with the land that most of us couldn't dream of. You drift off slightly, lulled by the thought, ice in the desert. It's a quiet sort of genius. And this is just the beginning of your frozen walk through Peru's ancient refrigeration secrets. You're still in the mountains, but you've begun to climb higher. Your legs ache, your lungs feel half deflated, and each breath is a little prayer to the thin air. Welcome to life at 3,800 meters above sea level, where the sky hugs you tight, and every step feels like a stairway to the gods. It's beautiful, sure, but it's not exactly spa weather. Cold stings your fingertips, even as the sun licks the back of your neck. At this altitude, the day and night have agreed to disagree on what temperature should feel like. As you shuffle through the crisp terrain, you come upon a stone path that winds through tufts of ichu grass, golden and waving like sleepy flames. Pews to take in the view valleys, scooped deep by time, dotted with terraces carved into the mountain's ribs. These terraces and dins weren't. just for growing potatoes and quinoa. Some may have served another purpose, one you wouldn't expect, helping the air cool dot. You turn your head, noticing a sudden drop in the air temperature as the sun slips behind a crag. Just like that, it goes from picnic in spring to forgot my coat in January. This exact contrast is what ancient highland dwellers mastered. They didn't just survive it, they used it. It's hard to imagine a place where it's hot enough in the day to make you sweat, and cold enough at night to freeze your eyebrows. But here, those extremes weren't inconveniences. They were tools. Tools for preserving, storing, and yes, even making ice. You pass a small stone structure to the ground, with walls a foot thick and barely any openings. It's one of many scattered across the plateau, and it's known as a kleka. These were highland storage units, used by the Inca Empire to hold surplus food for times of drought or disaster. Some were built with vents placed just so to allow air to circulate in a specific way. During the day, they remained relatively warm inside, shielding crops from direct sun. But at night, the temperature inside dropped sharply, slowing spoilage, sometimes enough to keep contents chilled. One scholar once compared these kolkas to early walk-in coolers, minus the hum of refrigeration coils and the gentle buzz of fluorescent lighting. And honestly, that's not far off. They were built with thick stones for thermal mass. The more mass, the more slowly heat enters or escapes. These folks may not have known Newton's law of cooling, but they lived by it anyway. You step inside, one ducking through a low doorway, and feel the difference immediately. The air's denser, colder. You wave a hand, half expecting to touch the edge of the past. It smells like dry herbs and dust, with maybe a ghost of maize still clinging to the walls. Historians still argue whether these kolkas were purely practical or had ceremonial significance. Some believe specific types of food like chunya, the freeze-dried potatoes we'll get to later, were stored in sacred spots as offerings to Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Others say they were just bureaucratic food lockers, part of the Inca's vast storage network. Whatever the case, they were placed with care. Ventilation mattered. Orientation to wind and sun mattered. This was not a random pile of rocks, don't you? Wander out and keep climbing, higher still. Your ears pop and the stars begin to show, even though the sun hasn't fully left. At this elevation, the Earth is closer to space than to sea, and that changes everything. Less atmospheric means less insulation. Heat escapes fast, super fast. That's the secret. One quirky tidbit. NASA once studied Andean highlands to understand how to replicate similar freeze-drying conditions on Mars. That's right, ancient Peruvians, without digital thermometers or satellite imaging, accidentally created conditions we now associate with interplanetary food preservation. You're basically walking in the ancient version of a Martian test kitchen. You settle onto a flat rock, dizzy but amazed. Bow around you. The landscape glows in that haunting purplish blue dusk. And even though you've only moved a few hundred meters higher, Your whole body feels it. Your water bottle has a thin glaze of frost forming around the edges. Your breath comes out like smoke signals. It's easy to see how, over time, these people came to understand the mountain's patterns. Which slopes cooled fastest, which stones retained warmth longest, which valleys trapped wind. It wasn't magic. It was watching, waiting, tweaking, and trusting in trial and error. Maybe a little magic, too, depending on who you ask. A few minutes pass. You find yourself dozing a little, lulled by the silence. But something flickers in your peripheral vision. Rustle, maybe. Mew jolt upright, only to find a small group of Vicucus trotting past, their slender legs barely whispering against the earth. They glance your way, unimpressed, and vanish over a ridge. They've adapted to masters of the cold, just like the people who lived here. And just like those people, you start to feel the rhythm of the place, the pulsing quiet of altitude, the sharpness of each inhaled breath, the subtle ways the rocks hold heat, then give it up like a secret when no one's looking. Your fingertips brush against a chunk of rough granite. It's still warm from the day, but it won't be in an hour. And when it cools, it will do more than just chill the air. It will become part of a centuries-old system, as precise as any thermostat. A passive freezer powered by altitude and patience. So you keep going, because something deeper is pulling you. Not just the mystery of how they made ice, but the mystery of how they knew the cow you've been climbing so long that your legs have begun negotiating with your brain for early retirement. The trail flattens just a little, and they're up ahead you. Spot a cluster of stones that rise out of the earth like forgotten molars. You approach slowly, curiosity outweighing your fatigue. These aren't the usual colchicas. They're different, bigger, with oddly curved edges. They feel Persian, except you're not in Iran. You're still deep in Peru, which makes what you're looking at all the more curious. You might have heard of yakchals, those big, dome-shaped, ancient Persian ice houses that used to store frozen water in the middle of the desert. They used clever airflow, insulated materials, and evaporation to keep their contents cold. And while you don't see any domes here, the vibe is strangely familiar. The same physics, the same patience. But these folks didn't borrow blueprints from Persia. They engineered their own solution. Halfway across the world, you brush a hand along the outer wall. It's stone, but not just stacked for shelter. The walls are tilted slightly inward. The base flares out, creating a kind of bowl. It reminds you of a sink, not just for holding, but for catching. Water, cold air, shadows. Whatever it is, it's doing it intentionally. This isn't coincidence. It's strategy. Here. At 12,000 feet, the ancient Andean engineers didn't have domes. They had slabs. Not mortar, just gravity and precision. Yet they achieved the same effect as the famed Yakchal engineers. By day, these structures trapped heat in shaded corridors. By night, they let the biting air sink into their open basins. Water froze, food chilled, tail and the desert momentarily. surrendered to cold. Historians still argue whether this kind of architectural resemblance is pure parallel evolution, or some wild case of transcontinental knowledge drift. Did knowledge travel on whispers? Could traders or sailors have bridged the hemispheres before the Spanish? Or did two separate civilizations just stumble upon the same genius? Nobody knows. But here you are, standing in the middle of that question mark. You lower yourself to sit beside one of the basins, feeling the stone's residual warmth fading as night creeps closer. This isn't just passive cooling, it's predictive cooling. These basins weren't built to see what happens. They were designed with full understanding of how the night would behave. One fringe theory even claims these structures were laid out in the pattern of constellations, helping their creators sync construction with lunar or seasonal cycles. While most scholars call that poetic nonsense, you can't help but glance upward. The stars do feel involved somehow. And if you're wondering just how effective this method was, consider this. Modern researchers have recreated these conditions and successfully frozen water overnight using nothing but shallow ceramic pans. A few inches of water and the night air. No wires, no compressors, just patience and placement. But here's the kicker. What they made with that ice wasn't just water. It was something called chno. Think ancient astronaut food, but make it potatoes. Tiny Andean potatoes, freeze-dried over several nights, then stomped underfoot to remove moisture. They'd be left to bake in the sun, then frozen again. The result? Lightweight, preserved starch bombs that could last years, without spoiling. Imagine planning your pantry around ice you made by accident, or maybe not by accident at all. You rise and start walking again, weaving through more stone structures. Some are intact, others have collapsed, reclaimed by wind and dust. One basin, half buried, holds a puddle with the first glint of frost forming on its surface. It feels like a quiet victory, like the mountain agreeing to hold your secret for a little while longer. There's one more odd thing you notice: the alignment. These stone structures almost always face northeast, not due north, not randomly scattered. They're tilted just so, like a sunflower chasing light, or, in this case, avoiding it. Researchers believe this orientation reduced sun exposure while maximizing airflow. It's passive refrigeration, but deliberate, very deliberate. The average modern refrigerator works because of fans, coolants, insulation, and electric power. But these people harnessed thermal inertia, radiation, cooling, and evaporative loss without writing any of it down. They used rocks and shadows, water and waiting, the kind of science that feels more like storytelling. Or maybe the kind of storytelling that was science. And it makes you wonder, were these ancient chill-makers scientists in feathers and woven sandals? Or were they just observant farmers, tinkering and testing until it worked? The truth is probably both. One fun little side note: archaeologists have found llama dung mixed into some of the insulation layers. Yeah, not very glamorous, but dung was used to fill cracks and gaps in the walls, much like modern insulation foam. And once dried, it held temperature remarkably well. It's not a detail that makes it into most textbooks, but it's a reminder that ancient ingenuity was also deeply aromatic. So now, as the frost builds and the stars thicken above you, you sit back and smile. You've just met a civilization that beat the desert using nothing but stone and air. No yakchuls, no help from Persia. Just the Andean version, sharp, simple, effective. And that's the part no one tells you. Refrigeration didn't come from the West. It came from every direction, wherever clever people got tired of watching. Their potatoes rot. You wake to the crunch of frost beneath your boots and the soft sigh of the valley. Morning light spills over the ridges like a lazy stream of honey, golden and thick, warming your face but not quite your fingertips. The world feels quieter up here, like someone turned down the volume on reality. And nestled in that hush is the next piece of the puzzle, the technique the ancient Peruvians used to turn cold nights into preservation miracles. You follow a trail lined with brittle grass and occasional stone markers until you arrive at a small, cleared depression in the land. It looks like a shallow bowl carved gently into the plateau. Around the edges are raised berms of soil and rock, deliberately constructed. Inside the bowl are patches of cracked, dry earth and what appear to be smooth stones, scattered like chess pieces. Welcome to the heart of the tuna-making zone. Now, tuno isn't just some rustic snack. It's a marvel of biochemical alchemy. And the Andean people didn't just invent it, they ritualized it, perfected it, and fed empires with it. First step, start with bitter potatoes, not the buttery Yukon Gold types you find at brunch. No, these are small, starchy, tough little tubers that grow in brutal high-altitude conditions where few crops survive. You spread them out under the open sky. That's it. No shelter, no covering. Just you, your potatoes, and the mercy of the mountain night. And the cold does the rest. The nighttime temperatures dip well below freezing. Water inside the potatoes crystallizes. Cell walls rupture. The tubers turn soft and grayish, like tiny zombie vegetables. But the process isn't finished, not even close, because the next morning, as the sun returns and warms the land, you don't eat them, no. You step barefoot into the field and stomp on them, not with rage, but with rhythm. You squeeze the moisture out like grape stomping, only less festive and way colder. The act of squishing isn't just for fun. It breaks down remaining cells, pushes out icy liquid, and starts the dehydration. And then you leave them out again and again and again. The cycle repeats. Freeze by night, dry by day. Over several days, the potatoes transform completely. They lose over 80% of their moisture. They shrivel, whiten, and become strangely light-like small, dusty stones. That's tuno. It can last for years, literally years, without rotting. Just rehydrate it, cook it, and boom calories on demand. Historians still argue whether tuna was invented in one miraculous moment of frostbite-fueled inspiration, or gradually over generations of high-altitude living. Some suggest it began as accidental waste, a batch of forgotten potatoes left out overnight that somehow turned out edible weeks later. Others think it was the result of observing wild plants and their responses to the cold. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: food security in a landscape that didn't hand out favors. And it wasn't just the preservation that was genius. Tuna is light, which means it could be carried in bulk by llama caravans across mountain passes. It was nutritious enough to sustain armies, reliable enough to stock royal storehouses, and versatile enough to become a staple in both peasant kitchens and imperial feasts. You walk through the tuna field, imagining dozens of figures, silently stepping across the potatoes in unison, their breath forming puffs in the morning air, their feet pushing history forward with every squish. The sound would have been soft flesh on frost-like muffled applause from the earth itself. One fringe tidbit: some villagers believed that tuna had to be made during a waning moon, or it wouldn't dry properly. Lunar timing was essential, they claimed, not just for frost, but for blessings. And if the moon wasn't right, you waited. You respected the rhythm of the sky as much as the rhythm of the land. You crouch near one of the rock piles and pick up a piece of old tuna left behind. It's feather-light with a texture somewhere between chalk and sponge. You give it a cautious sniff. It smells faintly of soil and something distant, like time itself dried out and preserved. So how did this all tie back to refrigeration? Well, the entire process hinged on freezings. Not mechanical freezing, natural freezing. You needed nights cold enough to solidify water inside the tuber. You needed clear skies to allow radiative cooling where heat escapes directly into the atmosphere. And you needed a dry climate to keep things from molding during the day. The Andean highlands just happen to offer the perfect trifecta. It's no wonder the technique spread. Variations of tuna making are still practiced today across Peru and Bolivia, using almost the exact same methods. That's over 1,000 years of culinary continuity. And while modern science can explain the freeze-dry mechanics, it still can't replace the cultural memory baked into each step. You wander farther and notice a stone basin filled with water, reflecting the early sky like a silver coin. This is part of the testing process. Before laying out the potatoes, farmers would use these shallow pools to check the night's freeze potential. If a thin skin of ice formed by dawn, it meant the weather was right. If not, no tuna that night. That's right, they made ice. Not just by accident, but on purpose. They harnessed night air to perform a task most of us need freon and humming electricity, for it's humble, quiet, and mind-blowingly efficient. And maybe, just maybe, that's the whole point. In a world where we chase speed and complexity, these people found abundance in slowness and stillness. They looked at rocks and shadows, frost, bend, and saw not danger, but opportunity. They used the mountain's own moods to sculpt their survival. And they left behind more than potatoes. They left behind proof that ingenuity doesn't require wires, just wisdom. You follow the narrow ridge trail as it curls above the potato fields and past the quiet stone basins. The air growing thinner, crisper, and even quieter. Your breath plumes like smoke as you reach a small, overlooked below you lies. A sprawling valley with ridges of steppe farming, etched into the hillsides like green, earthen tattoos. But your attention drifts to something more curious. Rows of rock piles aligned in straight geometric patterns. They look like ceremonial markers at first, but as you descend, they reveal a more practical purpose. These are wind baffles, deliberately placed stones used to manipulate airflow across the land. Yes, airflow. Because, as it turns out, the ancient Peruvians didn't just wait for cold weather, they steered it. You crouch beside one of the rows, poor. Each pile sits just a few feet from the next, not in a random pattern, but angled with shocking precision. Together they form channels that funnel the wind in a steady stream down toward the Chuno basins and water pans. The effect isn't loud or obvious, it's subtle. You hold up a hand and feel the air tug more insistently between the rocks. You're standing in an ancient wind tunnel now. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Highland Andean cultures, especially the pre-Inca and Inca themselves, were master environmental engineers. We're talking terracing, aqueducts, and microclimate farming. But less discussed and even more fascinating was their understanding of wind. They used stone placement to redirect it, not only for cooling, but also for managing humidity, drying textiles, and even calming erosion on steep slopes. Historians still argue whether these wind baffles were intentional refrigeration, aids, or simply part of erosion control. But archaeological patterns suggest placement near Chuno production zones was deliberate. In other words, they weren't just trying to save soil, they were coaxing the sky to chill their potatoes. This was ancient HVAC minus the ductwork. And here's where it gets fringe-level interesting. Some researchers propose that the layout of these wind channels mimicked patterns found in condor feathers. Not stylistically literally, as in they copied the layering geometry of condor wings to better control airflow. A bit maybe, but it makes for a killer image. Ancient engineers holding feathers against the wind, mimicking nature to make better food. You stand again and follow one such wind corridor, watching how the stones gradually descend toward another basin. This one's deeper, more formal, with a channel carved into one edge, likely for draining water or redirecting overflow. You step closer and notice frost still clinging to the inner curve of the stone, despite the climbing sun. The orientation matters here too. Everything seems tilted, just so like an orchestra of angles designed to play the coldest song imaginable. That's the brilliance of this whole system. It wasn't about brute force. It wasn't build a bigger fire or stack more ice. It was elegance, temperature manipulation via subtle shifts in geography, structure, and air You know how today we lose our minds over passive houses that regulate heat with clever insulation and window placement. The Andeans were doing that 1,000 years ago, with zero glass and a lot more AL packs. One fringe tidbit tucked in a field journal from a 1960s expedition tells of Quechua elders speaking of the breath of the mountains. An invisible spirit, they claimed, would glide down specific ridges and through certain stone lines, chilling everything it touched. You don't have to believe in mountain ghosts to admit they weren't wrong. Air does move that way up here. The stones help it breathe more deeply. You pause and sit on a flat boulder, letting your fingers trail across its cool surface. You imagine a family gathering around this very spot, laying out their tubers, aligning them with the shadow paths, adjusting the stones to shift the breeze just a little. Maybe it didn't look like science to them. Maybe it looked like respect, ritual, a mountain and a meal working together. Chuno wasn't just for survival. It was sacred. In fact, it appears in offerings buried with the dead, in storehouses designated for divine tribute, and in emergency caches prepared for lean seasons. It was more than food eat, was assurance. A whisper of preparedness passed down through generations. One open debate still simmers in archaeological circles. How widespread were these wind systems? Were they limited to a handful of highland communities? Or was this a standard part of Andean infrastructure? Satellite imagery suggests patterns of stone baffles scattered across the altiplano, but erosion and time have erased many. We may never know how common this wind-guiding strategy was, but what remains is enough to keep us guessing. As the sun climbs higher, you notice the frost finally beginning to melt. Tiny rivulets run toward the basin's edge, dripping into a carved channel and vanishing into the thirsty earth. The cold is retreating, but it'll be back tonight. Like clockwork, you rise, your legs stiff, but mind wide awake, and glance back one more time at the field, at the stones, the wind, the quiet command of people who didn't control nature, but conversed with it. You wonder if the wind still remembers, bit path, even now. And then the breeze picks up just a little, right on cue. The wind dies down by the time you leave the basin, and now the landscape changes once again. You pass through a narrow ravine dotted with yellow mosses and occasional splashes of purple lupins, and soon you emerge into an open plain scattered with odd stone circles and curious piles that look a little too organized to be accidental. This is where the sun joins the equation, not just as warmth, but as a precision tool. Because while the freezing nights did the heavy lifting, the ancient Peruvians didn't leave their food preservation entirely to chance. During the daytime, they turned to the sky for help, studying shadows like clocks, adjusting rock formations, to control when and where sunlight would land. That's right, you've stumbled into the realm of shadow engineering. You stand in one of those stone circles now. The air is warm, but only just. The stones are arranged with uncanny order, small, upright slabs in the center, surrounded by concentric rings of larger, flatter rocks. One set casts a long, sharp shadow that just barely touches the tip of another. You take a step to the side and watch the shadow shift, slicing across the pattern like a slow, silent sundial dot. And this is your historical fact. Ancient Andean civilizations, including the Inca, used interwart and literally hitching posts of the sun to mark solstices, planting days, and sacred rituals. But outside of formal temples, smaller communities developed more practical versions. These weren't about honoring gods. They were about knowing exactly how long your potatoes had been in the light. Here's the practical brilliance. Too much sunlight and your drying tuna would warm too fast, risking spoilage. Too little, and the drying process would stall. So they mapped sunlight like you might program a smart thermostat today only. They did it with stone, time, and patience. Historians still argue whether the smaller sun circles were universal beaches, or if each family adapted their own based on their land's layout. Some circles align suspiciously well with solar angles during equinoxes, suggesting shared knowledge. Others seem more bespoke, like each household had its own potato-based Stonehenge. And then there's the fringe idea, that some of these formations were designed to cast shadows, not just for timing, but for cooling. Picture this stone slabs, tilted just so, casting sharp-edged shadows across tuno piles during the warmest midday hours, like umbrellas made of geology, with the chill of night already doing part of the job. Managing the sun became the next piece of the preservation symphony. You bend down beside a slab and press your palm to its shaded side. It's cool, noticeably cooler than the surrounding air. That's no accident. These people were using thermal mass to their advantage. Stones absorb cold during the night and, if shaded, hold it into the day. Position them correctly, and they act like tiny refrigerators, not just passive coolers, but dynamic parts of a food preservation toolkit. One anthropologist once joked that these circles were like the farmer's version of a spreadsheet, visual tools for tracking time, temperature, and conditions. And honestly, that's not far off. You can almost see it. A farmer watching the shadow touch one specific rock, nodding to himself, then going to turn the tuno or lay out a new batch. As you walk farther, you find other variations, low walls, shaped like zigzags, circular pits with polished stone floors, and even what looks like a crude mirror made of volcanic glass. Light, shadow, wind, stone, they used it all. Not with computers, but with lived experience and quiet observation passed from mother to daughter, from elder to apprentice. Here's a fringe tidbit for the sleepy trivia crowd. In certain highland villages, elders claimed the shadow lines were also used to predict early frosts, not just based on temperature, but by how early the sun's shadow touched a particular stone each afternoon. If it fell too soon, they said, the frost was coming early, and it was time to prepare extra ceno. No one's ever proven that trick works, but you kind of hope it does. One particularly large slab stands like a monolith facing east. You sit beside it, watching the shadow creep slowly along a groove carved into the dirt. It looks meaningless, but someone once measured this path daily, marking changes, noting subtle shifts. It wasn't mysticism, it was metadata, and it worked. You start to understand that refrigeration in ancient Peru wasn't about finding one magic trick. It was about layers, each climate element tuned just right. Freezing winds at night, controlled dehydration during the day, wind funnels to aid circulation, shadow markers to time exposure, stones to shield heat. It wasn't flashy, but it was dependable, and dependable meant survival. There's an open scholarly debate about just how much this system influenced the Inca Empire's growth. Did Chuno, this humble, freeze-dried potato, actually fuel the infrastructure that allowed them to build roads, wage campaigns, and survive famines? Some argue it was essential. Others think the empire would have thrived without it. But you have to wonder, would you plan a 200-mile llama caravan through the Andes if you couldn't pack a lightweight, nutritious, zero-prepped food? Probably not. The air smells faintly of dust and dry herbs now. A kestrel drifts silently overhead. The valley is warm, but still hushed us if the stones themselves are listening. You pick up a small chuno left near the circle's edge. It's firm, pale, and unchanged, despite who knows how many years. You hold it up. Its shadow falls across your palm, a perfect circle. Your journey presses on, and with each step, the ingenuity of ancient Peruvians grows harder to ignore. You descend a rocky path, and the terrain shifts again, this time to what feels like a forgotten plateau, high and dry, where the wind whistles and there's not a tree in sight. You'd expect nothing but brittle grass and baked earth here, but instead, you stumble upon yet another surprise. A stone-cold storage pit tucked cleverly into the ground. It doesn't scream refrigerator, but you're getting better at spotting the signs. This depression in the earth lined with smooth stones, shaded by a lip of rock, and hidden in plain sight, was once a coca, or Andean storage silo. Time for your mainstream fact. The Inca Empire maintained a vast and organized network of food storage sites across the highlands, an ancient logistics system complete with taxed food deposits, state-run warehouses, and emergency supplies for hard winters or imperial campaigns. Calculus weren't just practical, they were policy. But out here, beyond the empire's urban strongholds, smaller communities built their own micro-versions of these storage units. You drop to a crouch beside one and peer inside. The pit stays cool despite the sun. A light draft flows over the stones, and the ground beneath smells faintly mineral, like the inside of a dry cave. This was no ordinary hole. It was crafted to take advantage of thermal inertia, the Earth's natural ability to stay cold the deeper you go. And now the quirky bit. Archaeologists have found calcus in some pretty unusual places, carved into cliffsides, hidden beneath burial mounds, and even stacked inside caves. that had to be accessed on all fours. Some were shaped like upside-down cones to funnel cold air downward. Others had spiral walls to catch breezes and spin them gently. Piles the food piles, somewhere between Mad Genius and Minecraft base. You lean back and glance at the horizon. The land looks barren, but you realize now that every ridge and dip was chosen on purpose, to preserve, to protect, to provide. Historians still argue whether these private kulkas were part of a formal community network, shared like a town pantry, or if each family jealously guarded their own stash. There's little writing, after all. Most of what we know comes from oral tradition and the stubborn evidence of architecture. But standing here, the quiet suggests something communal. After all, why place your precious tuno out here in the open, far from home, unless someone else was watching over it? Some kalkas were sealed with clay stoppers, creating oxygen chambers that kept pests and moisture at bay. Others had slatted stone walls for airflow in the driest highland zones. Storage rooms were dug into south-facing slopes because in the southern hemisphere, south equals shade. That's a level of geographic literacy most of us don't use until we lose cell service and can't find north. You climb down into a partially collapsed pit. The stones are still cold. You press your palm against one and feel it almost like touching a forgotten memory. A carved niche in the wall may once have held small offerings, maybe a llama bone, a bundle of coca leaves, or a carved figurine to bless the harvest. Because this wasn't just food storage. It was life storage, a fringe tidbit that's whispered more than recorded. Some villagers believed the kalkas were watched by Apu spirits, mountain deities who protected their contents. If a thief took tuno without offering thanks or worse, lied about what they stored, they risked illness, misfortune, or dreams filled with biting winds and weeping children. Superstition, sure, but effective if you want to keep your neighbors honest. As you crawl back out of the pit, your fingers dusted with ancient soil, you spot the remains of a woven basket, half crushed but still clinging to its circular shape. You wonder how long it sat here, maybe centuries, maybe longer, and still the structure is intact. That's what happens when people plan for the long term. There's another layer of brilliance in all this, tuno. When properly stored in these pits, could last up to a decade, yes, 10 years, without preservatives, without plastic, without asking your cousin for freezer space. The tuno stayed dry, lightweight, and edible. It could be boiled back into soup, fried into pancakes, or even rehydrated for ceremonial dishes. And here's the wildest parts. Some kalkas weren't just for potatoes. They also stored quinoa, maize, dried meat, charqui, and medicinal herbs. These stone pantries were curated survival kits. You could live off what they held if a frost ruined your fields or a drought stretched too long. In a world where everything depended on altitude and rainfall, this was as close as you got to insurance. You sit for a moment on a low stone bench beside the ruins. The wind moves slowly now, like it's searching for something. Maybe it's sifting through stories, brushing your shoulders with old breath, trying to remind you that refrigeration didn't begin with buzzing boxes or humming coils. It began with stillness, observation, generations who learned that coal wasn't just something to fear, it was something to cooperate with. There's a silence here that doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like someone once whispered advice into the wind, and it's still hanging around, hoping you'll hear it. So you dust off your hands, stand again, and step away from the pit. The storage is empty, but the wisdom still lingers. As the path snakes upward once more, your legs begin to ache, not from the steepness, but from the altitude. The air thins. Each breath tastes like dry snow and sun-warmed granite. Up here, above 4,000 meters, you've entered the death zone for most crops, where even the hardiest tubers dare not grow. Yet, strangely, people lived here. And not just survived, they thrived, experimented, innovated, because high above the farmland and above the cold storage pits, you find the most surreal structure yet, a network of ancient Andean refrigeration platforms, deliberately flattened terraces paved with stone, designed not for growing but for freezing. Here's your mainstream fact. The tuna-making process often began not in someone's backyard, but on Pampas Helitus natural or man-made frost terraces, where harvested potatoes were carefully laid out under the night sky. These weren't random, open fields. They were chosen for their altitude, airflow, and proximity to water runoff. Cold, clear nights would drop temperatures below freezing, and the next day's sun would begin the first dehydration cycle. But these people weren't just dumping spuds on a rock and hoping for the best. They treated the freezing ground like a craftsman's table, a space of intention and careful balance. You arrive at one now. It looks like a football field of stone, tiles, irregular, cracked and aged, but still eerily level. The sun has just dipped behind a slope, and a thin mist starts to rise from the edge. Here's the quirky tidbit. Locals believed that mist was a sign of a good tuna night. It meant that both humidity and temperature were primed for the slow dance of freezing and thawing. You'd be surprised how many farmers could predict the weather with better accuracy than your favorite app-by smell, by bird calls, or even the way their llama fur fluffed up before dusk. You crouch to run your fingers over the ancient stone. Surface, it's cold, not icy, but in waiting, like it knows what's coming. You picture a Quechua farmer centuries ago, tiptoeing barefoot across this very spot in the moonlight, spreading his potatoes in neat rose knot, for aesthetic, but for even exposure. Any overlap could mean rot. Uniform freezing was key. That and this is where a scholarly debate simmers. Some believe these frost terraces were used communally. Entire villages would coordinate their harvests and take turns freezing potatoes over the same set of platforms. Others argue they were claimed by lineage groups, your great-great-grandmothers. Freezing platforms stayed in the family like a cold-weather heirloom. Still others suggest a hybrid system, where your spot was your own, unless your neighbor's crop failed. And then, well, A little generosity never hurt as you step across the stone. Your boot presses into a shallow groove worn down by centuries of human feet. It's a reminder this wasn't just a science, it was a ritual. Every night, during Chuno season, someone would stay up late, checking the temperature, guarding the harvest from foxes or thieving neighbors, whispering to the sky like it could be bargained with. And during the day, the cycle continued. After that initial freezing, the potatoes had to be walked on. Yes, walked on. The pressure squeezed out moisture, and it was often children's job to stomp them with bare feet like grape treading in reverse, only colder. There's even oral tradition suggesting that the kids sang songs while doing it. Rhythmic chants that matched the beat of their frozen foot marching dot. You can imagine it now, the sharp crack of ice crystals, the squeaky squish of juice underfoot, the giggles echoing across the valley, even as numb toes danced on frost-bitten tubers. A chilly party, but one rooted in survival. Your breath fogs as a cold gust rolls in. Even in June, this plateau plays by different rules. The freezing begins not in the deep of winter, but with the shift of the sun, because here, even the angle of light matters. The terraces were often aligned to catch just the right amount of morning sun enough to encourage slow dehydration, but not enough to melt the freeze too quickly. And here's a lovely fringe detail. Some chuno makers added secret ingredients, not for flavor, but for preservation. A sprinkle of volcanic ash, a dab of river clay. Some say these helped absorb toxins. Others say they just added flavor or kept pests away. There's even a myth about chuno blessed with coca leaves lasting twice as long, though no archaeologist has dared test that in a lab. You sit down on a flat rock at the edge of the platform, gazing out over the vastness. Somewhere down below, llamas graze lazily among wind-carved boulders. The world feels ancient here not because it's old, but because it remembers. These terraces still exist, not because they were lucky, but because someone thousands of years ago looked at a rocky mountaintop and said, This is where I'll freeze my potatoes. And just like that, refrigeration was born. Not from an invention, but from observation. Not from electricity, but from alignment with earth, wind, shadow, and time. So next time your freezer hums in the kitchen, maybe give a quiet nod to the barefoot child stomping chuno by moonlight on a sacred slope above the clouds. You've climbed, crouched, and shuffled your way across freezing platforms and down into storage pits. But now it's time to follow the cold beyond architecture and stray into ritual, because in the Andes, refrigeration wasn't just survival, it was sacred. You descend along a spine of cracked shale, where stone steps wind like lazy rivers, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Below, a flat hollow opens up, almost theatrical in how perfectly shaped it is. If this were a stage, the audience would be made of wind and stars. And there, arranged in a horseshoe of boulders and flattened rocks, sits a ceremonial space, not a temple exactly, But not just a place to freeze potatoes either. You're looking at a Chuno Autopart agricultural lab, part shrine, part open air, meeting ground. Mainstream fact incoming. Across the Andean highlands, food production was closely tied to seasonal ceremonies. Offerings were made not only for successful planting, but also for successful processing, especially when it came to Chuno. The earth had to cooperate, so the people gave thanks. Sometimes they offered chicha, a fermented corn beer, sometimes coca leaves, sometimes the very first Chuno of the season, wrapped in a woven cloth and buried at the edge of the terrace. Today, you're standing in one of those offering zones, stones blackened by time and smoke, with carved basins, likely used for holding liquids or incense. The smell of burnt herbs and llama fat may have long faded, but the shape of the space still whispers of ritual. At the center, a small, raised, stone-smoothed flat. That's where the Pachamama offering would have gone. Mother Earth herself, paid in potatoes. And here comes your quirky tidbit. The first batch of Chuno made each year was often tested not by eating, but by watching animals. If guinea pigs, dogs, or even birds went for the freeze-dried spuds, was a good sign. If they avoided it, bad omen. Start again. The mountains had spoken. You take a seat on one of the rocks, trying not to disturb anything, even though no one's been here for centuries. Still, there's a weight in the air, like you've entered someone's house without knocking. Pew. Find yourself whispering, not out of fear, but respect. Historians still argue whether these Chuno-related ceremonies were tied to formal Inca religion, or whether they predated it, stemming from older local traditions, that the empire later absorbed. The Inca were famously good at borrowing a little god from here, a sacred animal from there, blended smoothly into state-approved ritual. But these highland Chuno ceremonies feel different, earthier, more personal, less about empire, more about survival. You shift your gaze to a row of upright stones, each barely the height of your shin. They might look random, but some scholars believe they represent family ancestors, guardians of the Chuno harvest, before refrigeration became chemistry and circuitry. It was about trusting the land and the land's memory, carried through stories, stones, and whispered thanks. A light wind picks up and swirls some fine dust around your boots. If you're quiet enough, you can almost hear music, not loud. A single flute, maybe, or a panpipe. That wasn't uncommon. Some Chuno ceremonies included music under the stars, played softly through the night while the potatoes froze, as if lulling them to sleep. That's not a joke. Some Quechua elders have said that a potato frozen to silence dies better. You let that sink in. And let's pause to consider a beautifully strange truth. Even though this all sounds rustic, this entire process was rooted in scientific precision. The Chuno makers had no lab coats, no data charts, but they understood cycles, thermodynamics, microbial decay, and moisture ratios in ways most of us couldn't explain without Wi-Fi. Their laboratory, mountains. their tools: feet, wind, sunlight, and time. You step carefully to the basin at the center and stare down into it. Rain has collected inside a shallow pool, reflecting the sky. You see yourself, but also not you. Look, ancient, dirt-smudged, wind-chapped, squinting against history. And for a moment, you understand the reverence. Cold wasn't just temperature, it was transformation, turning perishable into permanent, peril into preservation. There's one more fringe whisper you should hear before leaving. Some highland villagers believed the first chuno of the season had prophetic power. If it cracked too easily, it meant conflict ahead. If it smelled too sweet, it meant too much rain. If it kept its shape, peace, prosperity, and a good llama birthing year. Laugh if you want, but when your survival depends on clouds and frost, even a potato's crack becomes an omen. You rise slowly, brushing the dust from your palms, and step back from the altar. The wind calms, as if giving you space to leave. You walk on, but the sacred lingers. It trails you like smoke, like memory, like the faint crunch of frozen soil under bare feet. Because refrigeration here was never just about keeping things cold. It was about gratitude, offering, listening, and leaving. Just enough behind for the earth to remember your name. You continue along a narrow ridge path, your boots crunching over gravel and frost-bitten grass, until the slope falls away again this time into a broad, stepped valley striped with agricultural terraces, each one a tear in a mountainous amphitheater built not for drama, but for food. These aren't just any terraces, though. These are some of the most efficient thermal structures ever built by human hands, designed not to trap the cold like those chuno platforms earlier, but to manage it. Welcome to the living thermostats of the ancient Andes. Let's start with a mainstream fact that's more mind-bending than it has any right to be. The Incas and the cultures that came before them mastered the art of thermal zoning. That means they could simulate different microclimates on a single slope, growing warm water crops on lower terraces and frost-resistant ones higher uphill within the same field. Each terrace was a tiny climate experiment, using sun exposure, wind breaks, and carefully layered soil and stone to control moisture and temperature, centuries before climate-controlled greenhouses. These folks had it figured out with nothing but rocks and intuition. But what's that got to do with refrigeration? Everything. Because once the harvest was in, these same terraces played another role as slow-drying beds for storage crops. And more importantly, as the entry points to underground refrigeration vaults, you approach one now. A seemingly ordinary terrace, but a narrow stone hatch near the edge gives it away. You lift the hatch. It groans like a forgotten piano and peer into a subterranean chamber, its sides lined with stone, dry as bone, cool as dusk. This was a kolka, one of thousands of ancient Andean cold cellars. Think of them as root cellars engineered by mountaintop mathematicians, stored inside not justinho but maize, beans, quinoa, and medicinal herbs kept fresh and unspoiled for months. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some kulkas were also guarded by carved stone faces or animal motifs, possibly to ward off spirits, thieves, or, overly curious llamas. You imagine sneaking down here by torchlight, trying not to wake a stone puma watching you from above the door. You step down slowly, one boot after another, into the cool, almost reverent silence of the chamber. It's not large, perhaps, the size of a modern walk-in closet, but the air feels dense and ancient, like it's been waiting for centuries to be useful again. In here, the temperature holds steady, even when the mountain sun scorches the valley outside. How? Because the walls were packed with layers of porous stone, ash, and earth, creating a natural insulation system so good it rivals modern refrigeration insulation. Without a single watt of electricity, you brush your hand along the wall. There's a fine, powdery residue, perhaps old maize dust, or maybe volcanic ash used to repel bugs and mold. Either way, it's working. Even after all this time, the space smells ... clean, dry, ready. Historians still argue whether kulkas were communal, imperial, or household structures. Some believe the Inca state had a vast food redistribution network that relied on enormous state-run kulkas along highways and trade routes. Others suggest smaller family-owned vaults, one per household, passed down like a family recipe and guarded with the same intensity. There's even debate about who was allowed access, whether storage was democratized or strictly rationed. Regardless, you can't help but marvel. All of this was a cold chain system before that term even existed. A method of growing, processing, storing, and distributing food across a massive mountainous empire, without refrigeration as we know it. Now, imagine this. Somewhere out there on the other side of the empire, a messenger in sandaza chasqui, sprinting across narrow trails with a satchel full of freeze-dried potatoes, tucked beside dried alpaca jerky and maybe some coca leaves for energy. He's running from a kulka just like this one, high in the hills, on his way to supply an army, a temple, or a hungry neighboring village, and the chuno inside his bag. It'll be good to eat next year, or the year after. That's the miracle, poor of this place, of these stones. They didn't just slow rot, they slowed time. You step back into the light and close the hatch behind you. The terrace above still hums with a breeze. Nearby, you notice a channel carved into the rock wall by the many irrigation aqueducts that funneled water between terraces. But during chuno season, some of these would be diverted, not for watering crops, but for rinsing potatoes during the final stage, after foot treading. A gentle stream, cold and slow, washing away the last of the bitterness. And here's a fringe idea. A few experimental archaeologists in Peru believe that some kulkas might have been scented. Pives, scented, using bundles of herbs like munna or wild thyme to keep pests at bay and make the chamber smell nice. Imagine a 15th century Andean Martha Stewart showing off her mint-scented cold vaults to visiting dignitaries. You let that image dance for a moment, robes swishing, jammer bells jingling, and tuna perfectly stacked beside sweet-smelling beans. Back up the hill now. You look over the valley again and realize something simple but profound. Ancient refrigeration here wasn't separate from agriculture. It was the next phase of it. Growing, harvesting, freezing. Storing it was all one long arc of intention, held together by stone, shadow, and ceremony. You descend further along the mountainside, the air thinning slightly as you go. And now the terrain grows stranger. The pathways are scattered with odd stone arrangements, not quite altars, not quite storage pits. Some form circles, others long channels, like miniature canals. You pause by one that's shaped like a giant spiral, its stone edges neatly stacked, its center sunken and shadowed. No labels, no ropes to keep tourists out, just history, sitting here with the patience of eternity. Welcome to one of the more debated and lesser understood parts of ancient Andean refrigeration, the solar shadow. Traps. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Andean engineers were obsessed with sunlight angles, not just for warmth and agriculture, but also for measuring time, marking seasons, and in some places enhancing the freeze-drying process itself. Structures like the one in front of you were designed to work with the winter sun's low arc, casting long shadows at just the right times of day. The shaded side stayed cold longer, while the exposed side absorbed enough heat to keep moisture from reaching. It was the freezer and the dryer in one neat stone coil. No wires, no cords, just precise angles and keen observation. And now for your quirky tidbit. Some of these spiral or radial designs align so precisely with solar solstices that modern architects have had to double-check their software after trying to replicate them. Andean builders without telescopes or trigonometry were tracking the sun with an accuracy that rivals GPS, all for the sake of keeping a potato from turning soggy. You walk slowly along the curve of the spiral, imagining someone 1,000 years ago doing the same, planting their first tray of half-frozen potatoes in the shaded pocket, whispering a quick prayer to the mountain spirit, then backing away, not touching, just waiting. Historians still argue whether these spiral traps were a standardized part of refrigeration, or more experimental one-off local inventions that never quite scaled up. Some believe they doubled as astronomical calendars, letting communities predict the best time to start Chuno season. Others say they were ritualistic tools, used in special years when the climate was especially unpredictable, and the gods required a little extra precision. You sit on the edge of one of the stones and glance toward the horizon. The sun is just low enough to cast a perfectly crisp line between light and shadow, one side of the trap glowing gold, the other now bluish and damp with cold. It works. 1,000 years later, it still works. Further down, you come across a set of paired channels, like symmetrical grooves carved into the bedrock. Each groove leads into a sunken chamber with no visible outlet. The temperature near them drops noticeably. You lean over the lip and peer down inside. The walls glisten slightly, the dampness preserved from morning mist or the last rain. It's cold pooling, a technique used by ancient Andean engineers to create localized cold zones. Cold air sinks, warm air rises in. They understood this well before anyone bothered writing it down. Now, here's a truly fringe theory to warm your sleepy brain. Some archaeologists think a few of these cold traps may have been used to cool water for ceremonial drinks, especially for chicha shared during ancestor feasts. It sounds far-fetched until you realize how intentionally these channels are carved. They're not random erosion. Someone planned this, whether for food, ritual, or just a cool place to stash your favorite fermented corn brew. The idea of drinking the cold becomes suddenly very real. As you walk between the traps, you see scattered shards of broken pottery, ancient cups, jars, and storage urns. Some have delicate etchings of what might be stars or llamas, or maybe even stylized representations of frost. One fragment catches your eye, a small curve, inked with a faint spiral, matching the traps just behind you. A potter long ago left their mark. You wonder if they were proud of it. Suddenly you realize this isn't just engineering. It's art, functional, grounded in observation, but still artistic in its devotion to cycles, sunlight, cold, time. You lie down for a moment on a flat stone warmed by the sun. The wind carries the dry smell of clay and dust. Overhead, a hawk glides silently, casting its own moving shadow across the spiral as if inspecting your work, or maybe just hungry. Beneath you, the rock holds its temperature like a battery. It's a quiet comfort knowing that even without fire, even without technology, the ancient people of these mountains found ways to command the cold. Not fight it, not escape it, just work with it. A final quirk before you move on. In some villages, tuno pits were paired with sleeping stones, where workers would nap during the freeze-drying season, using the warmth of the day to rest, before another long, frozen night of foot-stomping and rinsing. You may not be a tuna maker, but the temptation to nap here, sun on your face and the spiral just beyond your reach, is very, very real. But you rise, eventually, because the story isn't done. Not yet. The stones have more to whisper, and the cold still has more secrets to give. You head down the next slope, the trail softening into gentle sand, the rocks giving way to earthen walls studded with chunks of obsidian and bone-white quartz. This is not farmland. This is ritual ground, and the air tells you so thin, still laced with the faint mineral bite of incense long burned away. Here, ancient Peruvians took their understanding of cold and married it to their cosmology, using refrigeration not just to store food, but to commune with God's ancestors and natural forces larger than themselves. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Andean religion revolved around nature deities, especially the apu spirits of the mountain. The people didn't just survive the cold. They believed it was sacred. The freezing night was seen not as an enemy, but a messenger. If Chuno survived the cold, it meant the Apis had blessed it. If it rotted or failed to freeze properly, something had gone wrong spiritually, not just scientifically. You pass what looks like a low platform, ringed by stones and adorned with remnants of woven offerings. This is likely a Walker sacred place. These weren't always grand temples. Many were subtle, quiet, even portable. Some were just stones believed to possess power. This one, situated near a Chuno pit, suggests a fascinating possibility. Ritual refrigeration, not just practical storage, but cold as a way to preserve the sacred offerings, relics, even bodies. Yes, the bodies, your quirky tidbit. In some Andean societies, mummification wasn't just reserved for kings or elites. High-altitude communities practiced a form of freeze preservation using mountain cold, allowing select ancestors to remain alive in community life. These mummies would be brought out during festivals, dressed in ceremonial clothes, and offered food and coca leaves, sometimes even placed in stone refrigerators for protection between events. Imagine grandma living in a climate-controlled niche, coming out once a year for a dance and a chat. A little macabre, sure, but also kind of ... sweet. You edge toward a natural rock shelter and spot a carved seat, smooth from centuries of use. This may have been a priest's perch, or a spot for the guardian of the Chuno to keep watch. The night freeze was a sacred time, after all. Some traditions held that only certain people could supervise the Chuno process, those born under particular stars, or those who had been purified through fasting and coca rituals. Andean cold was ritual space. Not everyone could touch it. Historians still argue whether some of these practices predate the Inca, or whether the Incas systematized and amplified local beliefs to unify their sprawling empire. What's certain is that cold became a mediator between worlds, way to speak to the mountain gods without setting foot on their peaks. You crouch beside a low offering table. The surface is warm, pitted. A few faded pigment traces linger, ochre, ash, maybe powdered maize flour. One groove channels downward into a narrow drain, perhaps for libations. Maybe someone once poured chicha or melted glacier water over a chuno here while reciting prayers. You can almost hear the whisper, "May the cold be kind." Further along the ridge, you see the entrance to a cave vault, now partially collapsed. Inside, the temperature is noticeably lower. This could have been a place where both food and relics were stored, cold, blessed, and kept hidden from ordinary eyes. Some archaeologists have discovered wrapped bundles in such caves, combinations of food, coca feathers, and bones intended to feed not the living, but the dead. A fringe theory. Some researchers believe these caves doubled as time capsules, preserving not just food, but knowledge. Ropes knotted with quipu patterns, textiles woven with symbolic diagrams, even frozen specimens of rare plant soil, intended for future generations or distant descendants. to be opened during times of crisis. Think of it as an ancestral emergency kit locked in stone and ice. Dot as you sit near the cave mouth. You notice the light-shifting, cool blue shadows creeping in as the sun dips behind the far ridge. It's hard not to feel a hush here, even in your breath. The silence isn't empty. It's expectant, like the land itself is remembering something. You sip water from your flask, and the metal is cold to the touch, same as it would have been centuries ago, in a flask made of gourd or fired clay, wrapped in woven reed to protect the hands. The Andeans understood how to respect the cold, to work with it, to fear it, but most of all, to listen to it. Because in this place, cold wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. It was alive. Your steps echo slightly as you move away from the sacred ground, and behind you, the spiral traps, the quiet terraces, the stone-faced culkus. They all seem to lean just a little closer, not ominously, just watching, remembering. The mountain holds its secrets well, but tonight it's shared a few with you. You ease down the slope now, toward lower terraces where the terrain flattens and the air thickens with the scent of earth-damp soil, faded vegetation, and distant smoke from some unseen cooking fire. These aren't the sacred heights or the wind-whipped Chuno pits anymore. No, here you're entering the everyday realm, the households, workshops, and communal storage spaces where cold was woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. Here's your mainstream historical fact at the height of their reach. Incan storage systems were among the most sophisticated in the pre-industrial world. The empire maintained thousands of culca storehouse strategically placed along roads and in agricultural zones. Many were specifically designed to exploit the cold, especially in the highlands. Some sat perched at altitude for the chill alone. Others featured ventilation shafts, double walls, and carefully angled eaves to control airflow and temperature, working like passive refrigerators. It's like walking into an ancient walk-in freezer, except you can still hear birdsong and your toes are in sandals. You pass a row of reconstructed culkas now, their stone walls rising low and square, grass roofs pitched sharp to shed rain. A few have been restored for tourists. Others lie as they were found, half-collapsed, moss-choked, doors missing. But look closer. Inside, the floors are lowered earthen pits, some with leftover clay lining to help maintain dryness. Some even show traces of salt in the soil natural. These weren't random food closets. They were climate-engineered vaults. And your quirky tidbit, in some regions, guinea pigs were used as living thermometers. Yes, those adorable squeaky snacks had more than one job. People noticed that guinea pigs huddled in certain corners of the culka during temperature shifts, helping caretakers identify cold spots or damp zones in need of repair. You've heard of canaries in coal mines. Now meet kais in climate control. As you explore, you picture the daily flow of life here. Porters arriving with sacks of potatoes, quinoa freeze-dried meat. A keeper kneeling to check moisture levels. Children sent to fetch a dried pepper from a low shelf. may be swatting at one another with woven grain fans. This wasn't just so, was a logistics machine, humming along, powered by sunlight, wind, and carefully shepherded cold. You crouch to peer inside a narrow side chamber. Inside, broken ceramics, a stone spindle, maybe a dropped sandal. Everyday artifacts, yes, but together they whisper the story of a people who lived with precision. Historians still argue whether these storage systems were centrally managed by the state or jointly maintained by local families. Some point to state-issued tokens that allowed access to supplies, while others believe there was a rotational stewardship household taking turns to maintain the cold. The truth, as always, is probably a blend. Outside the Colchis, you find a rectangular plaza, once a bustling market space, now just a canvas of grass and stone. It's here that preserved goods were exchanged, bartered like currency. A bundle of tuna might buy a clay bowl. A roll of sun-dried jerky called fetch woven cloth or coca leaves. Refrigeration, in a way, became economy. The ability to preserve meant the ability to plan, to trade, to prosper. And in a world without coins or banks, cold storage was your investment portfolio, a fringe theory. Some scholars believe the Incas intentionally planted cold-capable crops like oca and mashua in certain altitudes, because they responded better to freeze-dry, not for taste, but for durability. Entire agricultural calendars may have been crafted not just around seasons, but around which crops could best survive the sacred freeze. You rest beneath the shadow of a calca wall, the stone surprisingly warm on your back. From here, you can see the long serpentine outline of an old Inca road, threading between hills, connecting these cold vaults with distant valleys and settlements. It's a road built for walking, for llamas, for the kind of travel that carries stories and potatoes side by side. A moment passes, and you imagine a porter trudging up that paths, sandals kicking dust, breath puffing in the cold air, cargo bouncing. On his back, what's he carrying? Likely tuna, light and dry. Enough food to feed a squad of soldiers or an entire village during lean months. That dried spud, its power, its insurance against famine. A rock-hard nugget of survival. And it wouldn't exist without the frost, without the meticulous work. Put farmers, foot stompers, priests, and engineers. You smile, thinking of the irony. The world today is full of machines, built to simulate this natural wisdom. Freeze dryers, blast chillers, vacuum sealers. Yet here, 1,000 years ago, people had already cracked the code with just altitude, stone, and a whole lot of patience. And sometimes a guinea pig. The wind kicks up again as you rise and follow the slope downward where the landscape shifts. One more time-steep peaks giving way to highland valleys. And the utilitarian rhythms of daily life bleeding into something more ambitious. Because here, at the bottom of the cold chain hierarchy, you find something bigger than the coca, bigger than the tuna pits, bigger than even the sacred shrines perched in stones. You find the logistical marvel that held it all together, the Capac Own, or the Great Inca Road. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The Capac Own stretched over 25,000 miles, connecting mountaintop temples, administrative hubs, and cold storage zones. More than just a highway, it was a nervous system, pulsing with runners, jama caravans, and imperial intention. But beyond the boots and sandals pounding its stones, the road was lined with infrastructure tambos, way stations, kulkas, watchtowers, and freezing fields that turned it into a refrigerated supply route. Think of it as the world's earliest cold chain logistics, with llamas instead of trucks. The stone beneath your feet is polished smooth from centuries of passage. Flat, stable, often elevated for drainage. The road was engineered for both elevation and efficiency. The higher the road, the colder the air, and the more efficient the preservation. Cold was not an inconvenience. It was a feature. Goods like chuno, dried maize, coca leaves, and salted meat were kept fresh as they traveled, stored along the way in strategically cooled depots. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. Some tambos along the Capac Own were staffed by chosen women, known as a class the Virgins of the Sun, while often associated with weaving or brewing ceremonial chicha. Some records suggest they also managed cold-stored offerings and ritual foods. Imagine nuns who moonlight as freezer technicians. As you follow the road's gentle descent, you notice how the route snakes along shadow corridors, hugging the cliff faces where the sun's reach weakens. These weren't random detours. Historians still argue whether the placement of roads was designed to maximize cold exposure. But evidence points to deliberate choices. Paths laid along high-altitude ridges and shaded valleys, where stored goods had a better chance of surviving the long haul. If it was colder, it was closer to the gods and better for the potatoes. You pass a ruin that was once a tambo, its broken walls half swallowed by scrub. There's still a faint pit in the center, perhaps once a chuno cache, now filled with dust and lichen. Imagine the bustle that once filled this place. A runner collapsing on the stone, untying his load of frozen tubers. A woman scooping dried meat from a sealed jar. A llama chewing lazily in the shade while its handler dozes off on a cool slab dot. And then there were the chasquidos, tireless messengers of the empire. Running day and night, they relayed not just words, but perishables. Sometimes food needed to arrive as fresh as possible. And so cold preserved goods were hurried through the network, passed from runner to runner like a chilled baton in a relay. A modern food delivery system minus the apps, plus altitude sickness. A fringe theory. Some scholars believe specialized cold runners were trained to recognize spoilage and rehydrate dried food en route. They carried not just packets of chuno, but tools and herbs to test its integrity. Think of it like ancient quality control with a hint of shamanism. You pause where the road crosses a stone bridge. Below, a narrow stream trickles between rocks. Here, the Inca likely used running water as a cooling tool, building small aqueducts near tambos to keep the air moist and cold. It's subtle but effective. Nature did the chilling. Engineers just nudged it into place. Looking up, the valley opens wider, the sun dipping low behind serrated peaks. The light bathes the stone path in a golden hush. You realize that this road, this seemingly endless path carved into the bones of the Andes, is not just a transportation marvel. It's a temperature management strategy, a frozen thread tying together religion, science, agriculture, and empire. You pass another cluster of ruins, a stone pen for llamas, a resting platform, and another kulka, this one half sunken into the slope. Its door faces north, away from the harshest rays. Even in decay, the intention is clear. Protect the contents. Preserve the cold dot. And finally, you reach a plateau where the road splits toward several settlements. Each one once housed officials, priests, farmers, and runners, all working to keep the cold magic flowing, not with ice machines or mechanical chillers, but with the earth itself. You exhale. The air is thinner here, sharper, but still it carries warmth. Not the warmth of fire, but of people love countless hands that built this network. Passed dried potatoes from palm to palm, and trusted that the mountains would do their part, that the frost would come, that the shadows would stretch just right. You're no longer walking on a road. You're walking through a memory one, carved into stone, chilled by wind, and waiting patiently in the shade of time. You linger on the edge of that plateau, the sun behind you now dipping further, painting long shadows across the mountain floor. But the story doesn't quite let go yet, because here quietly, humbly comes the true genius of it all. Not just that the ancient Peruvians used cold to preserve their food, but that they embedded climate consciousness into their very architecture, rituals, and worldview. In other words, cold wasn't a tool. They saw it as a partner. Your mainstream historical fact here, in highland Peru. Even domestic architecture reflected refrigeration thinking. Some homes were built with split-level floors, the lower segments used for cool storage. Others included small stone compartments near doorways, shaded and ventilated, where perishables could last a few days longer. In colder months, food was stored directly under sleeping platforms, human body heat above, icy stone beneath. It's rustic, yes, but for people without plugs or power bills. It was elegantly sufficient. Now, here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you. Certain communities crafted stone cooling bowls, shallow dishes carved from basalt or andesite, left outside overnight, catching dew and frost. Not only did these cool water quickly, but they were also used in ritual divination. People believed the way ice cracked in the bowl could predict crop yield or even political strife. You've heard of crystal balls now meet the freezer dish. And in those same communities, the cold was celebrated, not feared. Some villages held winter solstice festivals where they reenacted the Chuno dances. There was a dance for stomping potatoes. Whole troops would mimic the stomping and freezing in dramatic fashion. Cloaked in woven garments, faces painted to resemble ice spirits. It wasn't just preservation, it was pageantry. But here's where things go hazy. Historians still argue whether these cold, conscious rituals were practical necessities disguised as faith, or spiritual rites that just happened to serve a practical purpose. Did they dance because it made Chuno better, or because they believed the cold gods demanded rhythm? Was Frost a Tulor, a deity? Even now, no clear answer. You shift your weight and begin following a fading trail downward one, not on any map. It curls between two outcroppings, dips behind a curtain of wild grass, and reveals a small open clearing. The light is silver here, filtered through evening haze, and in the middle stands what appears to be nothing, just stones. But come closer, look again. This is one of the ice altars marked on most guides, but whispered about in local legends. It's not grand, just a low circle of flat slabs, arranged in a ring, the center blackened from fires long dead. Pure, it said, cold itself was summoned. Offerings of frost-covered fruit, glacial water carried from the peaks. Even icicles wrapped in woven cloth were laid here, gifts to Pachamama, the Earth Mother who was believed to govern the seasons, pour, and the soil, and the still, cold breath of night. The quiet here is immense. You hear only the soft whistle of wind through grass, the distant rattle of a stone dislodged by time, and somewhere far off, the beat of a drum roll, maybe just your heart, sinking with the rhythm of a land that kept its perishables longer than most empires lasted. And there's one final thread in this woven cold tapestry. The knowledge never fully died. In some remote Andean communities today, families still make chuno, still use stone-paved chuno pits, still schedule harvests by frost calendars. Some even chant the same songs their ancestors used when trampling potatoes barefoot. And yes, some still believe that if the shadows fall just right on a particular hill, you'll have cold enough for 2 moons worth of storage. You step back now, slowly. The clearing fades as dusk stretches its fingers across the slopes. You follow a quieter trail homeward, past the last kolkas, past the Tambo ruins and frost-blessed road. Behind you, the icy altars rest in silence, because this was no accident of weather, no fluke of elevation. This was a symphony of stone, shadow, prayer, and pressure. This was refrigeration before the wires, before the hum of machines, before anyone had ever heard the word fridge. It was potatoes frozen by stars. It was ice born of ritual. It was food not just kept but cared for. And now, as you return to your own time, to your soft bed and modern comforts, the weight of that ancient wisdom settles like a woolen blanket, thick across your shoulders, because they didn't just beat the heat, they outwitted time. Wind dash down 300 words. The trail behind you vanishes in twilight now, and the sounds grow fewer, softer, just the faint hiss of wind slipping through grass and the echo of forgotten drums, like breath against stone. You're no longer walking, just floating, letting the ancient Andes fall behind. Take a slow breath in, the kind you draw while standing on a mountaintop at dusk, air thin and clean. tinged with ash and eucalyptus. Now breathe out, letting go of the weight of timelines and potato trivia and frostbitten rituals. The cold has done its work. Everything by is preserved, and nothing is urgent anymore. The mountains are distant now, the kelkas sealed, the runners gone quiet. Even the guinea pigs, huddled in their stone shelters, are still. The great Inca road fades beneath low mist, coiled like a snake curling into sleep. No more stomping, no more hauling sacks of dried potatoes over peaks. Just the hush of snowmelt and the rustle of woven tunics in dreams. Let your limbs go heavy now, like stone warmed by sun and cooled by moonlight. Let the cold fade not into discomfort, but into calm your breath, slowing to match the ancient pulse of a people who made peace with frost, because they weren't just trying to survive winter. They were trying to outlive it, and they did.